So welcome to another how-to of our set maneuvers training. Today we'll have a look at the TicToc Loop, which is an F3N maneuver. It's been in the sets maneuvers list for a couple of years. It's quite a high K of 10, so it's definitely one of the harder maneuvers to do. Effectively, it is a TicTocking vertical circuit. The only difference is that either your tail or your nose is pointing to the center of the circuit, and there are two half rolls and a flip, so that you're alternating between skids in and blades in. Let's have a look at an example. So this is a clockwise version. Half roll, flip, another half roll, back to center, and hover nose in over the center. So a fairly difficult maneuver. You have to be able to do TicTocking clocks, skids in and blades in. So let's go into a breakdown. So we start off in a nose in hover. This is for at least 1 second after your caller shouts start. It then pulls backwards vertically, and then you start your TicTocking either clockwise or anti-clockwise. So I'm going to go clockwise. That's it. So the number of TicTocs is not important in this. It's not specified in the guide. I tend to do about 4 during practice, but sometimes I'll find during a competition you might get blown around, or you might end up doing 5 or even 3 in your first quarter, and then you just need to keep it consistent. So if you've messed up a little bit in the first quarter, you need to keep it consistent across your other 3 quarters. So then you go into a half roll. Most people do this away from themselves because of historically you practice with the wind behind you, but whatever feels most comfortable. And then, so nose still points to the center, and you do your second quarter. So that was a flip at the top of the vertical circuit, and then into your third quarter, half roll, last quarter, back to center, and hover nose in right in the middle over the cone. And you need to be in that hover for at least a second before your caller shouts complete. So that was my preferred direction. Let's just have a look at why it's my preferred direction of doing things. Once again, we'll take the tail rotor thrust into account, which is fairly important to me. So at the moment, your tail rotor thrust is actually pushing you to the right in the hover. So you'll see you're slightly leaned over to counter that. So I prefer to go clockwise on this one. It makes for a really difficult start because you're going to have to fight that tail thrust in the first quarter. So you're going to see I'm really going to bank it over and then push into that maneuver, and now I'm actually fighting against the tail on the way up. Half roll, and now this is where it starts to get a bit easier in this direction. Is the tail thrust is pushing you up, pushing you over. It gets a lot easier. You do your half flip, and because the thrust is pushing you to the right, it's a nice, you don't have to really work it. You just kind of do the flip, and the tail thrust is enough to keep the momentum. It's now pushing you down, so you need to be concentrating a little bit more into your roll. Now the roll there, you saw the roll, I was still dropping in the roll because you want to keep this nice constant speed all the way around the vertical circuit. So on the way up, when you do that half roll, you want to be climbing through that, and then on the way down, when you drop through that half roll, you want to be dropping through that smoothly, so keeping the pace. So now you're actually on the way down in your last quarter. The tail thrust is actually pushing you back up. So it's actually going to be quite easy to maintain the speed, and it comes to a nice gentle stop, and there's no fighting. Now you'll see when we do the anti-clockwise version, the beginning is a bit easier, but the end there's a little bit more fighting going on. But you can obviously do either version. In fact, most of the time it comes down to practice. So let's have a look at the anti-clockwise version. Because of the tail thrust, nice easy start. You kind of push, you pull back, and the model already starts moving off to the right. It's helping you in the climb. It's pushing you up. Right, and then this is where you start fighting the tail, and I find things become a little bit more difficult. So you're now fighting the tail a bit, and in the UK, the wind the prevailing wind direction, if you're flying with the sun at your back during a competition, you generally try and fly with the sun at your back. Your prevailing wind direction is normally from the left or the southwest. So at this point, it's actually pretty horrible because you'll be fighting the wind and the tail thrust, and then you've got to do a flip. So either people tend to stall at the top, and it gets a bit sketchy. So pull it over. Right, and you see there, the momentum stalled a little bit. It just kind of slowed up after the half. Right, so you've got to fight it. Now it's coming down. It's a little bit easier here because the tail thrust is giving you lift. But as I said, with the UK wind, it can be tricky. And you've got your half roll. And this is also another a difficult bit for the anti-clockwise circuit, because you've got the tail thrust, as you can see, is pushing you over to the right hand side. You've got to stop that in as smooth as possible way. And you can see the way the model went over there, it really leaned over, because you've got to try and get it to stop as smoothly as possible. Just really horrible. So it's a little bit of a fight at the end on this one. So much easier start, but it gets harder. Right, so how do you go about learning this? Well, you have to be able to do a TicTocing clock, blades in and skids in, and if you've got to that point, the rest is really easy. We can have a look at the Pero Trainer. You won't get a huge amount of value out of the Pero Trainer. Maybe if you're kind of just learning the clock, you might want to do it. It's also good for figuring out how you want to do it in terms of which roll directions you prefer, or whether you prefer a clockwise circuit or an anti-clockwise circuit, but not much value in the Pero Trainer, unfortunately. You then want to move on just to doing regular clocks, and then doing them statically, so you can do the TicToc loop in the same place. So you're just keeping it in place and you're doing it. Right, you also want to work on your weaknesses. So I find that skids in, nose down to the right. So this one is probably my weakest point in the whole maneuver. So I will tend to spend quite a bit of time doing this, and you move it right, you move it back to center, you move it left, you move it up, and basically you're just getting used to all of the perspectives. So do diagonals as well. Right, and then if you do this a couple of evenings, you'll very quickly work through it, and it's nice that the perspective changes, which is what you're really trying to get to. So then after that, it's just a case of doing the full maneuver, figuring out what other weaknesses you've got, and then moving on to the real world. But as I say, if you can do clocks, skids in and blades in, the rest is honestly pretty easy. So good luck.